traffic idled under a brand new Miami pedestrian bridge in March of 2018, the drivers not knowing engineers were meeting on the span above them about cracks splitting its concrete. Florida International University sits across an 8-lane highway from Sweetwater, the town where thousands of its students rented apartments they could not afford on campus. For years, the walk between the two meant sprinting across live traffic on Southwest 8th Street, and university officials wanted to fix it with something dramatic. What they built to solve that problem, and one decision made in a 5-minute conversation on the morning it fell, is the choice investigators would spend the next 19 months taking apart. Southwest 8th Street, known locally as Tamiami Trail, carries 8 lanes of fast-moving traffic past the edge of the FIU campus, and for years, students treated crossing it on foot as an accepted risk of living in Sweetwater. Pedestrian injuries on that stretch were common enough that university administrators and local officials had been pushing for a dedicated crossing long before a shovel ever went into the ground. The solution they eventually landed on was not a simple overpass. It was something FIU wanted to turn into a landmark. To pay for the crossing, FIU and the Florida Department of Transportation's secured a federal Tiger grant, a competitive infrastructure fund meant to reward exactly this kind of ambitious public project. The total budget landed around $14 million, folding together federal money, state money, and university money into what planners called a model public-private partnership. On paper, it looked like a case study in getting infrastructure built fast and cheap. In practice, that same urgency to finish quickly would shape almost every decision that followed. The design contract went to Fiji Bridge Engineers, a firm with a national reputation for cable-stayed spans. Fiji's lead engineer of record was a man named Denny Pate, whose calculations would later sit at the center of a federal investigation. Munilla Construction Management, known as MCM, won the construction contract and paired with FIG under a single design-build agreement. That single contract structure meant the same team designing the bridge was also responsible for building it, with one outside firm checking their work. Because Fiji and MCM were under one contract, the project relied on a separate firm, Bolton Perez and Associates, as an independent peer reviewer checking Fiji's structural calculations. That is standard practice on major public bridges, a second set of eyes meant to catch what the original design team might miss. It is also a system that only works if the reviewer has the time, authority, and information to actually push back. On this project, the review process would later be described as one of the case's central failures. To build the bridge, the team chose accelerated bridge construction, a method built around one core promise. Instead of erecting a structure piece by piece above a live highway, crews build the heaviest, riskiest sections off to the side, away from moving traffic. Once finished and tested, the span gets lifted or wheeled into position in a matter of hours instead of months. FIU and FDOT marketed this as the safer way to build. 5 days later, that promise would be tested in the worst possible way. The heart of the design was a cable-stayed pedestrian bridge with a main span roughly 174 feet long, built as a concrete truss meant to eventually hang from cables strung to a tall central pylon. The truss itself was engineered to stand largely on its own during the gap between installation and the pylon's completion. That in-between state is not unusual in bridge construction. It is, however, exactly the condition the span was in on the day everything went wrong. On March 10, 2018, crews used a fleet of self-propelled modular transporters, hydraulic platforms capable of carrying enormous loads on hundreds of individually steered wheels, to roll the 950-ton main span across the median and swing it into position over Southwest 8th Street. The operation took roughly 6 hours and closed the road only for that single afternoon. It went off without a single reported problem. University officials called it a triumph of modern engineering, and for a few days it was treated exactly that way. FIU held a public celebration around the move, complete with officials posing for photographs in front of the newly placed span. It was framed as proof that accelerated construction could deliver a landmark safely and fast, a story university communications teams were eager to tell. Somewhere underneath that celebration, in the concrete itself, a different story was already starting to show. Cracks nobody had planned for were forming in the exact connection the whole span depended on. The cracks were concentrated at what engineers call a nodal region near the north end of the truss, the point where two diagonal support members labeled 11 and 12 in FIU's drawings met the main structure. Some cracking in new concrete is normal and expected. What FIU and MCM were now looking at was cracking wider and more extensive than anything considered routine. It was the exact connection the entire span's stability depended on, and it was already showing signs of distress before the bridge had carried a single pedestrian. 2 days before the collapse, FIU's lead engineer, Denny Pate, called the Florida Department of Transportation. He left a voicemail describing the cracking and offering his judgment. In his own words, "It did not appear to be a safety issue, though it should be looked at." That message sat inside a state agency with regulatory authority over the very road running underneath the bridge. Every collapse has a paper trail. You just have to know where to look, and in this case, the trail starts with an unanswered phone message. Nobody at FDOT called Denny Pate back before the bridge came down. The message did not trigger an inspection, a road closure, or an urgent follow-up conversation because on paper it read as a routine update rather than a warning. That gap between what an expert says and what a bureaucracy hears would turn out to be one of the case's most consequential failures. It would not be the only meeting about those cracks that week, and the next one would happen with far higher stakes. On the morning of March 15th, 5 days after the celebration, representatives from FIU, MCM, and FIU gathered at the bridge site to talk through the cracking in person. This was not a formal hearing with binders and sign-in sheets. It was a working conversation between the people who had designed the bridge, the people building it, and the people who owned it, standing under the very structure they were discussing. Should Southwest 8th Street be closed while they figured out what was happening to member 11 and 12? The people in that meeting made a judgment call. The cracking, they decided, did not rise to an emergency requiring an 8-lane highway shutdown during business hours. Traffic kept moving beneath the span as it had every day since the bridge went up. Instead of closing the road, the plan was to send workers back onto the deck to tighten steel rods running through the cracked connection, squeezing the concrete back together. The structure did not fail. The decisions did, and this was the first of several that morning. The repair itself had a name and a specific engineering logic behind it. Retensioning meant taking steel rods already running through the cracked members and pulling them tighter, adding compression to counteract the tension that was pulling the concrete apart. Done correctly, on a healthy structure, that kind of post-tensioning adjustment is a completely normal maintenance procedure used on bridges everywhere. The problem was that this connection was not behaving like a healthy structure, and nobody in that meeting fully understood how little margin it actually had left. By early afternoon, a small crew was back on the span near member 11 and 12, carrying out the retensioning work the meeting had approved. Below them, Southwest 8th Street carried its normal flow of traffic, commuters, students, delivery drivers moving through a road that had never been closed. Nobody driving beneath that bridge had reason to know a structural repair was underway above their windshields. In a matter of minutes, that gap between what the engineers knew and what the drivers knew would collapse into a single catastrophic moment. At 1:46 that afternoon, cars sat stopped at a red light directly beneath the north end of the span, the exact section where crews were mid-repair. Nothing about the scene looked unusual from the street. Nothing about it looked unusual from above either, at least not to anyone who was not staring closely at member 11 and 12. Whatever margin of safety that connection had left after 5 days of cracking and one incomplete repair attempt was about to run out. The main span failed at the North Nodal connection and rotated downward, bringing roughly 950 tons of concrete and steel onto the roadway in seconds. The structure landed across all 8 lanes, crushing the vehicles, stopped beneath it, and trapping the crew working on the repair. Dust and debris rolled out across the intersection as drivers further back slammed on their brakes. In less time than it takes to read this sentence, the landmark FIU had celebrated 5 days earlier became a disaster scene. Within minutes, fire rescue crews, police, and emergency medical teams converged on the site from across Miami-Dade County. Search and rescue began almost immediately, teams working carefully around unstable concrete slabs to reach anyone trapped below. News helicopters were overhead before the dust had settled, broadcasting images of a structure that had been a celebrated achievement less than a week earlier. For the families of the people caught underneath, what mattered was whether their loved ones would come out of that wreckage alive. When the search concluded, 6 people had died and roughly 8 to 10 more had been injured. The dead included a construction worker who had been on the bridge carrying out the retensioning repair, along with several motorists whose cars had been stopped in traffic beneath the span. They were in exactly the place the bridge was supposed to make safer. That fact alone would shape almost everything written about this case for years afterward, starting with the investigation that opened the next day. News of the collapse spread through Miami fast, and for plenty of viewers the reaction was recognition, not shock. Most commuters have driven under a construction project and felt a flicker of unease they could not explain. Is there a piece of infrastructure near you that gives you that same feeling, a bridge or overpass you avoid? I would like to hear about it in the comments. That unease was about to become something investigators would spend the next year and a half trying to explain. By the next morning, NTSB investigators were already on site, treating the wreckage the way they would treat a plane crash, as a scene where every fragment of concrete and steel might be evidence. NTSB does not investigate every collapsed structure in the country, but a fresh bridge failure with multiple fatalities on a federally funded project brought them in almost automatically. Their job over the following months was not just to describe what broke, it was to explain why people who were supposed to catch this never did. Investigators spent months reconstructing the collapse piece by piece, cataloging sections of fractured concrete and cross-referencing them against FIU's original design drawings. They pulled internal emails, phone records, and inspection reports from FIU, MCM, FU, and FDOT, building a timeline accurate down to individual phone calls. They also brought in independent structural engineers to redo the load calculations, checking FIU's math against their own. What that math revealed was not a rounding error. It was a mistake serious enough to sit at the center of the failure. The central finding was that FIU had significantly underestimated the load the 11 and 12 nodal connection needed to carry. In the firm's own calculations, the connection was assumed to be far stronger than it actually was once built, meaning the safety margin engineers believed was there had never really existed. This was not a construction defect, workers building exactly what the drawings told them to build. It was a design flaw baked into the plans before a single truck delivered concrete to the site. Investigators also found that when the cracking appeared before and after the move, it was read by FIU's engineers as a manageable, non-structural issue rather than a warning sign of the underlying calculation error. Every time the crack width grew, the explanation offered fit inside what engineers already believed about the design's strength, rather than challenging that belief. That kind of reasoning, seeing new evidence and bending it to match a prior conclusion, appears again and again in structural failure investigations, and it is what happened here. The independent review by Bolton Perez and Associates was supposed to catch this kind of error before it reached a construction site. Investigators found the peer review process on this project did not include an independent recalculation of the load capacity at the Nodal connection, the same connection that failed. A second set of eyes only helps if it looks closely enough at the right part of the drawing. And on this project, that closer look never happened at the one point where it mattered most. Perhaps the most uncomfortable finding was procedural rather than technical. There was no clear, agreed-upon rule dictating who had the authority to close Southwest 8th Street the moment engineers noticed cracking serious enough to require a repair. FIU could recommend, FDOT could authorize, FIU could request. But in the moment that mattered, on the morning of March 15th, that shared responsibility functioned more like a gap than a safeguard, and the road stayed open. Remember that 5-minute conversation on the morning of the collapse, the one investigators would spend the next year and a half taking apart. By October of 2019, 19 months later, the NTSB held its final board meeting and issued its report. The board's probable cause finding placed the core failure on FIU's design and load calculation errors, compounded by misjudging the cracking and by breakdowns in how that information moved between FIU, MCM, FU, and FDOT. A single report, but it would ripple far beyond one bridge in Miami. Behind the findings sat a pressure familiar to anyone who has worked a fixed deadline project. The bridge was tied to a semester timeline, and a public unveiling FIU wanted to showcase, and that pressure rarely shows up as one bad decision. It shows up as a series of smaller ones, each defensible, stacking into something nobody would have chosen, seeing the whole picture at once. Laid end to end, the sequence looks almost inevitable in hindsight. Cracks found, a voicemail left, a meeting held, a repair begun, then collapse. In the aftermath, FIU formally cut ties with both FIU and MCM, the two firms that had designed and built the bridge under a single contract. The university that had celebrated the move 5 days before the collapse now faced a very different kind of scrutiny over how much oversight it had actually exercised on a project happening in its own front yard. That break in the relationship was the easy part. The harder part, working out who owed what to 6 families, was only just beginning. Families of the victims filed wrongful death and injury lawsuits against FIU, MCM, and other parties connected to the project, arguing that a preventable, documented risk had been allowed to remain over a live highway. These cases rarely go to trial in situations like this, where the paper trail, the calculations, the voicemail, the meeting notes is this extensive and this damaging to the defendants. Instead, most roads lead towards settlement, and this case was no exception. Reported settlements across the various defendants, FIU, MCM, and others connected to the project, are commonly cited in the range of more than $100 million combined, though the exact final total depends on which agreements and which point in the litigation you are looking at. No settlement changes what happened under that span in March of 2018. What it does is put a number on the cost of a decision made in a 5-minute meeting, a number the industry has not forgotten. FIU itself came under intense professional scrutiny in the years after the report. Its design work on this project cited repeatedly in engineering licensing reviews and in the broader industry conversation about accountability on design-build contracts. Public reporting does not point to criminal charges being filed against anyone involved, which surprises a lot of people encountering this case for the first time. The consequences here played out almost entirely through civil courts and professional licensing boards, not a courtroom with a jury and a verdict of guilt. Beyond Florida, the collapse sent a visible ripple through transportation departments in other states that were running their own accelerated bridge construction projects. Several paused ongoing work to review crack response protocols and re-examine how design-build contracts split responsibility for independent checks. Nobody wanted to be the next agency answering questions about a voicemail nobody returned. The industry's real response to this case was not to abandon accelerated construction. It was to rewrite the rules about who has to listen when an engineer says something might be wrong. Federal and industry bodies, including the Federal Highway Administration and engineering standards groups, absorbed the NTSB's recommendations into guidance aimed at exactly the gap this case exposed: clearer thresholds for when cracking requires closing a structure to traffic, and clearer lines of authority for who can make that call under pressure. None of that guidance can undo March 15, 2018. What it can do is make the next version of that 5-minute meeting end differently. It is worth placing this case next to another American bridge failure, the 2007 collapse of the I-35W bridge in Minneapolis, which killed 13 people. That collapse was traced to a decades-old design flaw in undersized gusset plates, worsened by construction equipment loaded onto the deck the day it fell, a failure quietly building for years without anyone flagging it. The FIU bridge failed for a different reason. This time, people were watching the crack and discussing it out loud on the day it gave way. That difference is exactly what makes the FIU case so unsettling to engineers who study it. Plenty of structural failures involve a defect nobody could reasonably have caught in time. This one involved a defect that multiple qualified people looked directly at, discussed out loud, and judged not to be urgent. The tragedy was not that the warning never came. The warning came early, came twice, and came in writing and on tape, and it still was not enough to change what happened underneath that span. There is an irony at the center of this story. Accelerated bridge construction exists to reduce how long workers and the public are exposed to an unfinished structure over live traffic. On paper, this project did exactly that, moving the dangerous work aside and closing the road for a single afternoon. But the method's safety case assumes the finished span behaves the way the drawings say it will. The moment that assumption breaks down, the exposure the method was built to avoid returns just 5 days later than anyone expected. To understand why one connection could bring down an entire 950-ton span, it helps to understand what a nodal region actually does. In a truss bridge, load does not spread out evenly. It concentrates at specific joints where diagonal members meet, funneling enormous forces through a relatively small, densely reinforced patch of concrete and steel. Engineers call this the diaphragm. If that one patch is under-designed, everything connected to it, no matter how well built, is only as strong as the weakest joint carrying its weight. That same concentration of force explains why the re-tensioning repair is believed to have triggered the final collapse rather than preventing it. Adding tension to steel rods running through an already cracked, already overstressed connection changes the internal forces acting on that concrete in ways that are difficult to predict without extremely precise modeling. On a healthy connection, the adjustment closes a crack safely. On one already past its real capacity, it can be the exact push that finishes the job the design error started years earlier. As the project's owner, FIU held a different kind of responsibility than FIU or MCM. It was not FIU's job to run the load calculations, but it was FIU's bridge on FIU's campus over a road FIU's own students crossed every day. Investigators and later litigation raised hard questions about how much independent judgment the university exercised in that final meeting, rather than deferring entirely to the design-build team's assessment that the cracking was not urgent. Ownership carries its own kind of accountability, blueprint or not. Part of what makes this case so widely studied is how ordinary the decision-making looked from the inside. Nobody in that meeting was reckless in an obvious, cartoonish way. Each person present had a legitimate, defensible reason to defer to someone else's judgment, the contractor to the engineer to his own prior calculations, the university to the professionals it had hired specifically because they knew more than campus administrators did. That diffusion of responsibility is exactly how a decision nobody would have made alone gets made collectively. Engineers who study organizational failure have a name for what happened here, a slow drift where a structure or process keeps working despite growing warning signs, so each new warning gets measured against the fact that everything held up last time rather than against the actual risk in front of you. The cracking had appeared once before the move, and nothing had gone wrong. That precedent, more than any calculation, is part of what made the second, larger round of cracking feel manageable instead of alarming. In direct response to the NTSB's findings, engineering and transportation bodies pushed out clearer standards for how crack width and crack growth should be evaluated on in-service and under-construction bridges, including firmer thresholds for when a structure needs formal reanalysis rather than a field judgment call. Training programs for bridge inspectors and project engineers now use this case specifically, walking through the actual crack measurements and the actual voicemail transcript to teach exactly the moment where a different call should have been made. Closer to home, the stretch of Southwest 8th Street near FIU carries a different weight for the local community now than it did before March 2018. Memorials have marked the site, and pedestrian safety on that corridor has stayed part of the ongoing conversation between the university, the city of Sweetwater, and Florida's transportation planners in the years since. The road that was supposed to get safer because of a bridge got a different kind of attention instead, the kind that comes only after something has already gone wrong. Today, the FIU pedestrian bridge collapse sits alongside cases like the Hyatt Regency walkway collapse and the I-35W bridge failure in engineering ethics courses across the country. Students are given the timeline, the voicemail transcript, and the meeting notes, and ask the question investigators asked. At what point, with the information available that morning, would you have closed the road? Most students working through it without the schedule pressure or professional deference in that room say they would have closed it immediately. This case keeps resurfacing in a broader American conversation about infrastructure that is showing its age, bridges, overpasses, and public works built decades ago and now carrying far more traffic than they were designed for. The FIU bridge was brand new, not old, which is part of why it unsettles people who assume newer automatically means safer. New construction can carry exactly the same kind of hidden risk as a crumbling, decades-old structure. It just wears a different disguise, a ribbon cutting instead of a rust stain. Accelerated bridge construction has not gone away. States still use it because, done properly, it does reduce risk to workers and drivers compared to older methods. What changed is how the method is discussed inside the industry, less as an automatic safety upgrade and more as a tool that only delivers when the design, the review, and the crack response around it are just as rigorous as the technique itself. The lesson was never about the machinery. It was about who spoke up and who listened. Every project this channel covers eventually comes back to some version of the same uncomfortable truth. A structure rarely fails because physics suddenly changed its mind. It fails because a specific person, in a specific meeting, weighed a cost against a risk and got the balance wrong, often for reasons that made complete sense to them at the time. The FIU bridge is one of the clearest examples on record because for once, almost the entire decision chain survives in writing, on tape, and in testimony. It is worth sitting with who was underneath that span. Aside from the one crew member on the deck, they were not construction workers who had accepted an occupational risk. They were commuters, students among them, doing the most ordinary thing, waiting at a red light on their way somewhere else, on a road they had driven 100 times before without a second thought. That ordinariness is what makes this case land differently than a disaster involving people who knew they were near a construction site. The one person on the bridge at the moment of collapse was there doing his job, carrying out a repair that his employer and the project's engineers had judged safe enough that morning. He was not a bystander to the decision that killed him. He was executing it, trusting the people above him in the chain of authority to have gotten the judgment right. That trust, extended by workers to engineers and by drivers to a bridge they believed was finished, is the quiet thread running through this entire case. Whether civil settlements and professional licensing consequences amount to accountability is a question that comes up constantly around cases like this one, and there is no tidy answer. 6 people do not come back because a company wrote a check or because an engineer's license came under review. What the process did accomplish was a public, exhaustive, rigorous account of what went wrong, detailed enough that it is hard for anyone in the industry to claim they did not know the risks of a case like this. Step back, and this stops being a story only about one bridge. Judgment calls like the one made that morning happen constantly. In hospitals, in aviation, in manufacturing plants, anywhere a warning sign has to compete against schedule, cost, and the human instinct to assume things are probably fine because they have been fine so far. Most of those calls never make the news because the underlying risk really was as small as everyone assumed. The FIU bridge is what happens on the day it is not. Somewhere near you, right now, there is very likely a piece of infrastructure carrying the same kind of quiet, unresolved judgment. Call this bridge carried for 5 days. A crack somebody decided was probably fine, a repair scheduled for next week instead of today, a road that stays open because closing it is inconvenient. Most of the time, that gamble pays off and nobody ever hears about it. This case is a reminder of what it looks like on the day it does not. Go back to that image from the beginning. Drivers stopped at a red light under a bridge, with a meeting happening on the span above them about the very cracks that would bring it down within the hour. Nothing about that scene looked dramatic from the street. That is precisely what makes it worth remembering, because the moment before almost every structural failure in this channel's back catalog looks exactly that unremarkable, right up until it does not. The FIU pedestrian bridge was supposed to be a small, hopeful piece of infrastructure, a safer walk home for students who deserved one. Instead, it became one of the most documented structural failures in American engineering. A case where nearly every warning sign survived on paper, on tape, and in meeting notes. It was not bad luck that brought it down. It was a string of reasonable choices made by qualified people who got the balance between risk and schedule wrong on one morning, and 6 families paid the price. If there is one thing worth carrying away from this channel, it is that the buildings and bridges around you are never just about concrete and steel. They are about the decisions of the people who built them. If a piece of infrastructure near you has given you that same uneasy feeling, you know what I mean. Subscribe to Kevin's Collapse Files for more of these stories. The paper trail behind the disasters the headlines never fully explain, and I will see you in the next one.